At my grandson's wedding, they gave me a seat next to a trash can. I didn't say it out loud when I first saw it, but the sentence settled quietly in my mind as I stood there, holding a small cream-colored place card with my name written in delicate cursive, Margaret Collins. The ballroom shimmered with soft golden light, crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished silverware and tall glasses of champagne. Everything was exactly as I had imagined it would be for Ethan's big day. Perfect. Elegant. Worth every dollar I had contributed. I had spent that morning carefully getting ready in my bedroom, choosing a pale lavender dress that my late husband once said made my eyes look brighter. I took my time with my hair, smoothing each silver strand into place, and even wore the pearl necklace he gave me on our 40th anniversary. I wanted to look like someone who belonged there. Someone who mattered. When I arrived at the venue just outside of Boston, a grand estate with manicured lawns stretching for acres, I was greeted with polite smiles but no real warmth. My son Richard gave me a quick hug, distracted, already turning back to speak with one of the groomsmen. Linda, my daughter-in-law, smiled in that practiced way of hers, lips curved but eyes elsewhere. "You look nice, Margaret," she said, before glancing over my shoulder as if someone more important had just walked in. I told myself not to read into it. Weddings are busy. People are distracted. I've always been the understanding one. I made my way into the reception hall, the sound of soft piano music filling the air, guests mingling and laughing, servers passing trays of appetizers. I felt a quiet pride watching it all unfold. Ethan looked so happy earlier at the ceremony, standing tall, his voice steady as he said his vows. I remembered the little boy who used to fall asleep on my couch after I read him stories, his small hand gripping mine. I had helped raise him in so many ways, stepping in when Richard and Linda were too busy building their careers. I had never asked for recognition. Just a place. Just a seat at the table. At the entrance to the reception, a neatly arranged table displayed rows of place cards organized alphabetically. I found mine easily. Margaret Collins. Table 12. I smiled to myself, imagining I'd be seated with close family, maybe near the front. That's where grandparents usually sit, isn't it? I walked slowly across the room, weaving between round tables draped in white linen, each one adorned with fresh roses and flickering candles. Laughter echoed around me, glasses clinked, and somewhere in the distance, someone called Ethan's name. I found table 10. Then 11. And finally, tucked awkwardly near the back corner of the room, partially hidden behind a large decorative column, I saw the sign, table 12. At first, I thought there must be some mistake. The table was smaller than the others. There were no floral centerpieces. No polished silverware neatly arranged. Instead, sitting right beside the single chair was a small, black plastic trash can, the kind you'd find under an office desk. Resting against it was a folded card. My hands felt suddenly cold as I stepped closer. The card read, in the same elegant script, reserved. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I was supposed to laugh, or ask someone, or simply walk away. But before I could decide, I heard it. A soft chuckle from somewhere behind me. Then another. I turned slightly and caught a glimpse of two women at a nearby table whispering, one of them covering her mouth as she smiled. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but I kept my posture straight. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder, smoothed the fabric of my dress, and without a word, I pulled out the chair and sat down beside the trash can they had chosen for me. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, fingers resting against the smooth fabric of my dress as if nothing was out of place, as if this was exactly where I had been meant to sit all along, and for a few moments I focused on the smallest details just to steady myself, the faint hum of conversation blending with the soft music, the clink of glassware, the distant laughter that seemed to ripple through the room without ever quite reaching me, and I told myself to breathe slowly, evenly, the way I had learned to do years ago when life asked me to endure more than it should have, because making a scene would only give them more to laugh about, more to whisper about, and I had spent too many years preserving dignity to let it slip now over something so deliberate, so carefully arranged, and yet so casually dismissed as a joke. So I reached for the program booklet placed beside the empty setting that did not exist, pretending to read the names printed inside even though the words blurred together, and out of the corner of my eye I noticed a young server. hesitate for a fraction of a second as she passed by my table, her gaze flickering between me and the trash can before she quickly looked away, and that small hesitation told me everything I needed to know. This was not a misunderstanding, not an oversight, this was visible, obvious, and somehow acceptable to everyone else in the room. I shifted slightly in my chair, adjusting my posture as though I were simply another guest enjoying the evening, but the truth settled deeper with every passing second. I was not part of the celebration, I was the quiet punchline tucked into a corner, and when I finally lifted my head, letting my eyes move across the room, I saw how easily life continued without me. Richard stood near the bar laughing with a group of men, his hand wrapped around a glass, his shoulders relaxed in a way I had not seen in years when he visited me, as if here, surrounded by people who did not expect anything from him, he could finally breathe. And Linda moved gracefully from table to table, greeting guests, her smile bright and effortless, pausing just long enough at each group to be noticed, to be admired, and when her eyes briefly passed over me, there was no surprise, no confusion, only a quick flicker of something that looked almost like satisfaction before she turned away. And that was when the last piece fell into place, because people do not accidentally place a grandmother at a table like this. They choose it, they design it, they anticipate the reaction, and they wait to see if you will break, if you will protest, if you will give them a moment they can later describe as you being difficult or dramatic. And I realized then that this had never been about seating arrangements or space or convenience. It was about position, about showing everyone exactly where I stood in this family now, not at the head of the table, not even among the guests, but somewhere off to the side, easy to ignore, easy to laugh at. And I could feel the weight of years pressing quietly against my chest, memories that did not belong in this room but insisted on surfacing anyway, mornings spent packing school lunches, afternoons waiting in parking lots to pick up a little boy who ran into my arms as if I were the center of his world, evenings helping with homework while his parents worked late, all of it leading here, to a chair beside a trash can, and for a moment, just a moment, I wondered if I had imagined my place all along, if I had mistaken gratitude for love, presence for belonging. But then I straightened my back just a little more, lifting my chin, because even if they had rewritten the story, I still remembered every chapter that came before this one. And I was not ready to let them decide how it ended. The laughter did not stop right away. It never does when people believe they are witnessing something harmless, something clever, and I could hear it ripple softly from table to table like a quiet agreement that this was acceptable, that this was amusing, and I kept my gaze forward, fixed on the center of the room where the newlyweds would soon be introduced, because if I let my eyes wander too much, I might catch another look, another smirk, another confirmation that this had all been carefully orchestrated, and instead I focused on breathing in through my nose, slow and controlled, the faint scent of roses and polished wood filling my lungs, grounding me in a space that no longer felt like it belonged to me. And that was when I heard her voice, low but clear enough to cut through the music, Linda, standing just a few feet behind me, speaking to a group of women who leaned in as if sharing something delightful, and she said, "Oh, it is just a little joke, she will not even notice." And the words landed with a precision that surprised me, not because they were cruel, but because they were so casual, so effortless, as if I had already been reduced to someone who did not deserve awareness, let alone respect. And one of the women let out a soft laugh, the kind people use when they want to belong to a moment, and another added, "Well, it is memorable," and I did not turn around, I did not need to, because I had heard enough. I had been given the confirmation that removed any doubt, any lingering hope that this had been a mistake, and something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, steady way. Like a door closing somewhere deep within my chest, because there is a difference between being overlooked and being intentionally placed aside, and I had just crossed that line without anyone thinking it mattered, and I let my hands rest a little more firmly in my lap, feeling the slight tremor that I quickly stilled, because I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel, not here, not now. And as I sat there, I began to notice the details I had ignored before, the way the seating chart must have been arranged with care, the way someone had chosen this exact corner, hidden enough to be out of the way but visible enough to be seen when pointed out, the way the trash can itself had been placed just close enough to my chair to make a statement without anyone needing to say a word. And that level of thought did not happen by accident, it required intention, planning, a conversation that likely took place long before today, perhaps over coffee or during one of those quiet evenings when decisions are made about people who are not in the room. And I wondered how long I had been part of that conversation without knowing it, how many times my name had been spoken in that same tone, light, dismissive, convenient, and I thought of Richard again, of the boy who used to look at me as if I could fix anything, who once cried when he scraped his knee and refused to let anyone else bandage it, and I compared that memory to the man standing across the room now, laughing, untouched by what was happening just a few yards away, and it occurred to me that indifference can be louder than cruelty, because it does not need to defend itself, it simply exists, unbothered, unquestioned, and as the music shifted and the lights dimmed slightly in preparation for the couple's grand entrance, I felt the final trace of hesitation leave me, replaced by something quieter, something colder, a clarity that settled in with a calm I had not expected, because if they believed I would sit here and accept this role without understanding what it meant, then they had underestimated not just me, but everything I had seen, everything I had endured, and everything I had quietly held together for this family long before this night ever began. As the room began to dim and the soft glow of the chandeliers shifted into something warmer, more intimate, I let my eyes rest on the dance floor where Ethan would soon walk in with his bride, and for a moment, just a brief and fragile moment, I allowed myself to remember a different version of this family, one that existed long before carefully arranged tables and quiet humiliation, back when life was measured in simple routines and small acts of care, when Richard was still young and uncertain, trying to build something of his own while leaning on me more than he ever admitted, and I stepped in without hesitation, because that is what mothers do, we fill the spaces that others leave empty, we hold things together even when no one asks us to, and when Ethan was born, I remember the first time I held him, how small he was, how his fingers curled instinctively around mine, and I promised myself in that moment that I would always be there for him, no matter how life changed around us, and I kept that promise in ways that no one ever documented, no one ever listed in speeches or toasts. I was there for the early mornings when Linda returned to work and needed someone to watch him. I was there for the afternoons when school let out and he needed a safe place to go. I was there for the evenings when homework turned into frustration and he needed patience more than answers. And over the years, those moments became the foundation of something I believed was unbreakable. Something that would naturally carry into days like this one, where family gathers not just to celebrate, but to acknowledge the people who helped shape the path that led here, and I had never asked for recognition, not once, not when I quietly covered tuition expenses that were described as loans but never repaid, not when I contributed to the down payment of their first home, not when I agreed without question to help fund parts of this very wedding so that everything could look as beautiful as it does tonight. I did those things because I believed in the idea of family, in the unspoken understanding that love is not always loud, but it is always present. And yet as I sat there now, separated not just by distance but by intention, I began to see those memories differently, not as shared experiences, but as one-sided investments that had slowly been taken for granted, repackaged as expectation rather than generosity. And it was not a sudden realization, it was something that had been building quietly over time, small moments that I had dismissed or explained away, like the times I was not invited to gatherings that I later heard about in passing, or the times my suggestions were met with polite nods but never followed, or the gradual shift in tone when Linda spoke to me, from appreciative to dismissive, subtle enough to ignore, but consistent enough to form a pattern, and I had chosen not to see it, because acknowledging it would have meant accepting that my place in this family was changing in a way I did not want to believe, and now, sitting beside a trash can at a wedding I helped create, that truth no longer asked for my attention, it demanded it, and as the doors at the far end of the room began to open, signaling the start of the next part of the evening, I realized that everything I had given, every sacrifice, every quiet contribution, had led me not to a place of honor, but to a seat that told me exactly what they thought I was worth, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it might mean to stop giving altogether. The applause rose gently as Ethan and his bride stepped into the room, hands clasped together, smiles bright under the soft glow of the lights, and I joined in, my hands moving slowly, deliberately, creating just enough sound to blend into the moment without drawing attention to myself, because despite everything, I could not bring myself to take that moment away from him, not completely, not yet, and as they made their way toward the center of the dance floor, I watched him closely, searching for something familiar in his expression, some trace of the boy who used to run to me without hesitation, but all I saw was a man focused on the life unfolding in front of him, unaware of the quiet fracture taking place just a few yards away, and I wondered, not for the first time, how much he knew, how much he had been told, and how much he had chosen not to see, because it is easier, sometimes, to accept the version of events that asks the least of you. And as the music shifted into their first dance, a slow melody that seemed to wrap around the room, I noticed a woman approaching my table, her steps hesitant, her expression uncertain, and when she reached me, she gave a small, polite smile and said, "Margaret, I did not realize you were seated here." Her voice carrying a tone that suggested she understood more than she was saying, and I recognized her after a moment, Helen Parker, an old acquaintance from years ago, someone who had attended a few family gatherings long before things began to change, and I returned her smile, steady and composed, saying simply, "Neither did I," and she glanced briefly at the empty space beside me, at the trash can that had become impossible to ignore, and then back at me, lowering her voice just enough to keep the conversation contained. "This does not seem right," she said, and there was no pity in her tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of what was plainly visible, and for a second, I considered brushing it off, offering the same explanations I had given myself earlier, but something in her expression made that feel unnecessary, even dishonest, so instead I said nothing, allowing the silence to speak for itself, and she nodded slightly, as if she understood the weight of that silence, before adding, "I overheard Linda earlier, she was talking about the seating chart. She seemed quite proud of how everything was arranged, and the words settled into place with a clarity that removed any remaining doubt, not that there had been much left to begin with, and Helen hesitated for a moment longer before placing a gentle hand on the back of my chair, not quite touching me, but close enough to offer a sense of presence. "You deserve better than this," she said softly, and then she stepped away, returning to her own table, leaving me once again alone with the quiet hum of the room, but something had shifted. Not in the way people might expect, not in anger or visible hurt, but in a calm, steady awareness that had been building since the moment I saw that place card, and as I watched Ethan and his bride continue their dance, moving gracefully across the floor, I felt a distance settle between what I had believed this night would be and what it had become, and in that space, I began to understand that this was not just about a chair or a table, it was about a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long, a pattern that I had allowed to continue by choosing silence over confrontation, generosity over boundaries, and now, sitting here with nothing in front of me but a reminder of how easily I could be set aside, I realized that the only person who could change that pattern was me, and the thought did not bring immediate comfort, but it did bring something else, something quieter, something steadier, a sense that this moment, as small and as humiliating as it might appear to others, was in fact a turning point, one that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, but something far more deliberate, far more lasting, and as the music drew to a close and the applause rose once again, I placed my hands together gently and joined in, my expression calm, my posture unchanged, already beginning to consider what I would do next. The music faded into a softer background rhythm as guests began to settle back into their conversations, chairs shifting, glasses being refilled, and I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the noise of the room pass through me without attaching to any of it, because once you begin to see things clearly, it becomes easier to separate what matters from what merely surrounds you, and I realized that nothing happening at these tables, none of the laughter or polite exchanges, had anything to do with me anymore, not in the way I once believed, and that realization did not sting the way it might have before. Instead it settled into something quieter, something more decisive, and I slowly reached into my purse, my movements calm, unhurried, retrieving my phone with the same steady hands I had used all evening, and for a brief second I looked at the screen without unlocking it, seeing only my reflection staring back at me. Composed, intact, not broken the way they might have expected, and I thought about all the times I had chosen patience over action, all the times I had convinced myself that maintaining peace was more important than addressing truth, and I understood now that peace built on silence is not peace at all, it is simply delay, and delays have a way of collecting interest over time, and tonight, that cost had finally come due, and I unlocked the phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, a number I had not needed to call in quite some time but had never deleted, because some things, like certain kinds of preparedness, remain quietly in place until the moment they are required, and I pressed the call button, lifting the phone to my ear as I stood up from the chair, smoothing my dress once more as if I were simply stepping away for a moment, not leaving something behind, and I walked slowly toward the edge of the room, past tables filled with people who barely noticed my movement, past servers carrying trays of food that would soon be served, past the carefully arranged decorations that I now saw for what they were, a surface that hid more than it revealed, and when I reached the hallway just outside the main ballroom, the sound softened, becoming distant enough to allow for clarity, and the line connected after only a couple of rings, a familiar voice greeting me with a calm professionalism that matched my own, and I spoke quietly, directly, giving just enough information to begin a process that had been waiting for a moment like this, a process that did not require emotion or explanation, only instruction, and as I listened to the confirmation on the other end, I felt a sense of alignment settle into place, not satisfaction, not yet, but certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself, and when the call ended, I lowered the phone slowly, holding it in my hand for a moment longer before slipping it back into my purse, and I stood there in the quiet hallway, taking a single breath that felt deeper than the ones before it, because something had shifted, something irreversible, and when I turned back toward the ballroom, the music, the laughter, the celebration all continued exactly as before, untouched by what had just begun, and I walked back inside with the same steady pace, my expression unchanged, my seat still waiting in the corner, but I no longer saw it the same way, because it was no longer a place I had been put. It was a place I had already decided to leave behind, whether I stood up from it or not. When I returned to the ballroom, nothing had changed on the surface, the music continued, glasses clinked, conversations flowed as if the night was unfolding exactly as planned, and I walked back to my seat without hesitation, each step measured, each movement deliberate, because there is a kind of strength in returning to the place where you were diminished and no longer feeling diminished by it, and as I sat down again beside that same small trash can, I noticed how different it looked now. Not as an insult, not as a statement about my worth, but as a symbol of something else entirely, something that no longer held power over me, and I rested my hands lightly on the table, or what passed for one, and allowed my gaze to move freely across the room without avoiding anything, without shrinking from any glance that might come my way, because I was no longer waiting for someone to acknowledge me. I had already acknowledged myself in a way that mattered far more, and across the room, I saw Linda again, moving gracefully between guests, her laughter easy, her posture confident, and for the first time that evening, I studied her without emotion, without resentment, simply observing, and I realized that people like her rely on silence, on the assumption that those they diminish will remain quiet, will continue to play the role assigned to them, and it is that silence that allows patterns like this to continue, unnoticed by some, tolerated by others, and as I watched her pause near the head table, leaning in to say something to Richard, I noticed the way he nodded, distracted as ever, not questioning, not looking around, simply accepting whatever version of reality had been presented to him, and that was when I understood something even more clearly. This was not just about Linda, it never had been, it was about a system of convenience, of choices made over time that slowly redefined where I stood, and I had allowed it, not out of weakness, but out of love, out of a belief that giving more would somehow preserve something that was already shifting beneath the surface, and now that belief had reached its end, not with anger, but with clarity, and as the evening moved forward, speeches began, one after another, voices filled with admiration, stories told with laughter and applause, and I listened quietly, hearing my grandson described as kind, generous, thoughtful, words that echoed pieces of the boy I remembered, and yet I also noticed what was missing, not my name specifically, but any acknowledgement of the years that came before this moment, the quiet foundation that made this celebration possible, and it did not surprise me, not anymore, because recognition is not something you wait for when you have already seen the truth, and when the applause rose again. After another speech, I joined in softly, my expression calm, my presence steady, already aware that the shift I had set in motion would not reveal itself immediately, not in this room, not in this hour, but soon, in ways they had not prepared for, in ways that would not require me to raise my voice or defend my dignity, because dignity, once reclaimed, does not need permission to exist, and as I sat there, surrounded by a celebration that no longer defined me, I felt something settle fully into place, a quiet resolve that did not seek attention, did not ask for validation, it simply was, and for the first time that night, I understood that I was no longer part of what they had planned, I was now part of what would come next. The evening continued with the kind of polished rhythm that only well-funded celebrations seem to achieve, each moment flowing seamlessly into the next as if nothing could disrupt the carefully constructed atmosphere, and yet beneath that surface, something subtle began to shift, Something small enough that most people would not notice at first, but clear enough to those paying attention, and I saw it begin near the front where the event coordinator stood quietly checking her tablet, her expression composed but slightly tightened, as though a detail had not aligned the way it was supposed to, and she leaned toward another staff member, speaking in low tones before both of them glanced briefly toward the bar, then toward the head table, and I followed that line of attention without moving my head, only my eyes, observing as one of the servers approached Linda with a polite but urgent posture, whispering something that caused her smile to falter for just a fraction of a second. Before she quickly recovered, nodding and dismissing the server with a small wave, but the ease in her expression did not fully return, not the way it had earlier, and I noticed how her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly as she turned back to her guests, her laughter now just a shade too controlled, just a shade too intentional. And it was a small thing, something that could easily be overlooked, but I recognized it for what it was, the beginning of a disruption, quiet, contained, but no longer entirely within her control, and across the room, Richard checked his phone, his brow furrowing as he read something, his attention drifting away from the conversation he was in, and he stepped aside, moving toward a quieter corner, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert. And I did not need to hear what was being said to understand that the evening was beginning to move in a direction they had not planned for, and I remained where I was, my hands resting calmly, my gaze steady, not searching for reactions but simply allowing them to unfold, because there is a certain clarity that comes when you are no longer invested in maintaining the illusion, and as the minutes passed, the changes became slightly more visible, a delay in service here, a quiet exchange between staff there, a subtle tension threading through conversations that had once been effortless, and I saw Linda glance toward the event coordinator again, this time with a question in her eyes that did not need to be spoken aloud, and when the coordinator approached her once more, this time with a more serious expression, Linda's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by something sharper, something closer to concern, and she excused herself from the group she was with, walking quickly toward the side of the room where they could speak privately, though not so privately that it went unnoticed, and I watched as their conversation unfolded in hushed tones, Linda's gestures becoming more pronounced, her composure slipping in small, controlled ways that only someone paying attention would recognize, and Richard joined them shortly after, his face set in a way that suggested he was trying to understand something that did not make sense, something that did not fit into the version of the evening they had expected, and I did not look away, I did not hide my awareness, because there was no longer any need to pretend that I did not see what was happening, and as I sat there, still in that same seat they had chosen for me, I realized that the balance had shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to be felt, enough to begin unraveling the certainty they had carried so confidently. Just an hour before, and I did not feel satisfaction in that moment, not the kind that comes from witnessing discomfort, but something steadier, something more measured, the quiet acknowledgement that actions have consequences, even when those consequences take their time to appear, and as the music played on and the guests continued to enjoy what they could of the evening, I remained exactly where I was, calm, composed, no longer defined by the place they had given me, but by the decision I had already made, a decision that was now beginning to make itself known, not through words, but through the subtle, undeniable shift that was slowly spreading across the room. The shift that had begun quietly now found its voice in the smallest disruptions that could no longer be ignored, and I saw it clearly when the event coordinator returned to Linda with a firmness that replaced her earlier hesitation, her posture straight, her expression composed but no longer accommodating, and Linda's reaction was immediate, her face tightening as she spoke more sharply than before, her hand gesturing toward the bar, then toward the musicians, as if trying to piece together a situation that refused to cooperate, and Richard stood beside her, his confusion deepening into something closer to concern, his gaze moving across the room as though searching for an answer that would restore order. But there are moments when order does not return, not because it cannot, but because something fundamental has changed beneath it, and I remained seated, watching without staring, aware of the growing tension that threaded through the room, subtle but unmistakable, as delays stretched longer than they should, as staff members moved with a purpose that suggested problem rather than routine, and conversations began to falter in places where they had once flowed easily, and it was not long before Linda's composure slipped in a way that could no longer be disguised, her voice rising just enough to carry beyond the private space she had tried to maintain, her words quick, insistent, asking questions that did not receive the answers she expected, and I saw the moment it reached her fully, the realization that something essential had been interrupted, something she had counted on without question, and Richard turned to her, speaking in a lower tone, his expression now serious, his earlier ease completely gone, and for a brief second, his eyes moved across the room again, this time pausing longer, as if searching not for a solution, but for a source, and I did not look away when that gaze passed near me. I did not lower my eyes or shift in my seat, because there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to protect in the way I once had, and as the music softened unexpectedly, the band exchanging uncertain glances before continuing with less confidence, I understood that the evening had crossed a threshold, one that could not be reversed by charm or explanation, and still, I did not move, I did not stand or approach them, because this was not a moment that required my presence at the center of the room, it required something far quieter, far more precise, and as Linda stepped away from the coordinator, her pace quicker now, her movements sharper, she headed directly toward my corner, her expression controlled but strained, and when she stopped a few feet from me, she did not sit, she did not soften her tone, she simply looked down at me with a question that carried more weight than any accusation, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow, not because anyone else noticed, but because the space between us held everything that had led to this point, and I met her gaze calmly, without hostility, without defensiveness, and in that silence, I let her see exactly what I had come to understand, that this was never about a seat or a table, it was about value, about choices, about the quiet assumption that I would always remain in the background no matter how I was treated, and I could see it in her eyes when she began to realize that something had changed, not just in the room, but in me, something she had not accounted for, and I spoke only once, my voice even, my words measured, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary, because explanations are for those who have earned them, and I simply said, I decided to stop paying for things that no longer include me. And I let the sentence settle between us, not raised, not emphasized, just stated, and the meaning of it moved through her expression in stages, from confusion to understanding to something else entirely, something that no longer held the same certainty it had at the beginning of the evening, and I did not add anything further, I did not need to, because the rest would unfold on its own, in the conversations that would follow, in the adjustments that would have to be made, in the quiet recognition that actions, once taken, cannot be undone simply because they are inconvenient, and as I sat there, still in the same place they had chosen for me, I understood that I was no longer part of their arrangement, I was the reason it no longer held together, and for the first time that night, the seat beside the trash can felt exactly where I needed to be, not because it defined me, but because it marked the moment I chose to redefine everything else.